Corey Clark, Head of Research and Due Diligence. Corey, thank you for joining us this morning.
It's my pleasure, Matt.
The bottom line is that Dalbar, going back over a number of years, has done something that is fancily titled the Quantitative Analysis of Investor Behavior. It's really a study, right, of how and what investors do, the average investor, correct?
It is. This past year was our 22nd annual study. And what we do is we look at the mutual fund industry, the thought being, especially with the rise of 401ks and the IRAs, most Americans hold mutual funds. So in looking at the mutual fund industry, we see that as being a proxy for the average investor, and look at the actual market appreciation or depreciation that was experienced in the mutual fund sector, and use that as our proxy for the average investor. And as you might imagine, the average investor has underperformed the index almost every year.
It's phenomenal. It really is. We truly, as investors, we're our own worst enemy. Let me give you some numbers from the most recent Dalbar study. In 2015, which was a rough year for the market, was up and down, very volatile. The average mutual fund investor underperformed the S&P by a margin of 3.66%. The S&P, as an index, actually was up about 1.38, but the average investor suffered losses on average of minus 2.28%. And then if we go back in time and you take a 20-year S&P look back, if you go back to 1995 and you study the S&P returns, just the index, between 1995 and 2015, 20 years, the annualized S&P return was 8.19%, but the average equity mutual fund investor averaged only 4.67. That's a whopping gap. Why? Why the big difference there?
Well, there are a lot of reasons for it. Not all of them are investor behavior, but investor behavior is, through our study, the greatest cause. But
I would assume fees come into play there too.
Certainly, yeah. Fees contributes to what we consider to be, we've calculated to be 79 basis points or 0.79% of that underperformance in fees. Just the lack of availability of cash to invest can cost the investor, as well as the need for cash. So that's the inability to put the cash in, or the necessity to take cash out, not because of investor behavior, because of your personal needs. So all of those things go into that number to some degree, but the highest, which was a full 1.5 percentage points of that underperformance, is pure investor behavior. And I can give you a few examples of what we mean by investor behavior, and I think some of these were on full display over the last few weeks with the Brexit crisis. But media response, herding, following the crowd rather than making a prudent investment decision. There's loss aversion, expecting to find high returns with low risk, not having realistic expectations. So these are just some, and we've highlighted 9 of them in our study over the years, but this is just a flavor of some of the subconscious things that set in our minds during market turmoil, which is the time where we see the underperformance most acute.
Corey Clark, Head of Research and Due Diligence with Dalbar, with us this morning. Corey, what you're saying in just simple old Southern plain English is people get out of the market at the wrong time, and they step back into the market at the wrong time. We panic, don't we? Look, I'm looking at the Wall Street Journal. This is from Tuesday of this week. The bull market chugs along. This is an article from the Wall Street Journal from Tuesday. Weekly flows of stock mutual funds and exchange-traded funds, and they look at inflows and outflows. You go back and you look at January of this year and February when the market was plunging. In the month of January alone, some $20 billion flowed out of mutual funds and exchange-traded funds. But in March and April, money started pouring back in. But that means that people got out at just the wrong time and bought back in at the wrong time, right?
Yeah, and that's typically what we see. I'll give 1987 as an example because it's certainly an extreme case. We saw mutual fund flows turn to the negative around October of that year. And with the exception of maybe 1 month or so, it never turned positive again for over 2 years.
Wow.
So the money was still flowing out almost 2 years later. And what some folks may not realize without, kind of looking at it, is that the market actually by the end of 1987 had fully recovered. The S&P was in positive territory at the end of that year. So from October to the end of the year, there was a full recovery. Yet 18 months later, we're still seeing money going out of the stock market rather than in, as far as mutual funds are concerned.
I think you mentioned earlier the 9 different things that lead to this. Let's touch on a few of those if we can. You talk about loss aversion. The fear of loss leads to a withdrawal of capital at the worst possible time, panic selling. Narrow framing is another terminology Dalbar uses. What is narrow framing?
Well, so I think, for a good example would be, just in these past few weeks, is concentrating on the market turmoil or what was going on in Europe at that time is really just one piece of the puzzle. And we know that the markets are dynamic and there's an infinite amount of considerations that go into the market. So to look at one particular geopolitical event or one particular thing and use that as the basis for your decision is too narrowly framing your decision and your considerations. So we would urge investors and we train advisors to be able to set expectations with their investors and to be able to sit down and bring all of these factors into consideration, not letting one that just happens to be in the news overwhelm all the other considerations that should be taken into account.
I mean, Corey, what you're saying is the reason over the last 20 years the average mutual fund investor has so underperformed the index is that, in part, we as humans take an incredibly short-term view. Oh my goodness, I must react to this right now, even if your retirement is still a ways off or you're going to, according to the life expectancy tables, live 25 more years. People are making snap decisions instead of taking a long-term view. That's the bottom line, right?
Yes, absolutely, Matt. I mean, we also have a statistic that we calculate as part of the study that we call retention rate. And so we look at the velocity of redemptions that are happening within these certain groups of mutual funds, so equity funds, for example, in this case, and looking at the velocity of those redemptions. On average, the average investor would only stay invested in that fund for a little over 4 years. And I think that we all know a long-term approach is a horizon much further than 4 years. So one is not going to realize the long-term benefits of the market simply being invested for 4 years and jumping out. So that's even more evidence of the fact that investors are probably not staying invested long enough.
Corey Clark with Dalbar. Corey, in closing, I'd like to look at the positive side of this. You all at Dalbar have 4, if you will, habits that the average investor can take on. These 4 things you all believe will reduce harmful behavior. Let's walk through those 4 in closing. Number 1, set expectations below market indices. Number 2, control exposure to risk. Number 3, monitor risk tolerance. And number 4, present forecast in terms of probabilities. If you've got the time, let's walk through each of those because this is what you guys at Dalbar are saying is the right thing to do. Number 1, set expectations below market indices. Expound on that.
Well, when you think about it, the market index is an average, and just by its very nature, half the people will be above the average and half the people will be below the average, generally speaking. So everyone wants to be above the average. Everyone wants to beat the market index, and that just cannot be the case by the very nature. So using the market, the S&P, the Dow, as your benchmark for what is success and what is failure is probably going to lead to more poor investor behavior. Setting those expectations more reasonably based on the rate of return that you need to achieve your goal is a better way to mute some of that poor investor behavior.
Excellent point. Number 2 ties into that. Here's a number 2 recommendation on how we can curb our emotions. Control exposure to risk. Without giving a specific fund recommendation there, Corey, what's the overall approach there?
Well, what we've seen is that when you are invested in an investment that has some component of capital preservation, that too will mute the poor investor behavior. One of the signs that points to this is when we do this analysis, we do it for equity funds, we do it for fixed income funds, and we also do it for asset allocation funds. So the asset allocation funds, which will, by their nature, be more diverse and have some degree of capital preservation in a lot of cases. In speaking of the retention rate, it was about 4 years for equity funds. It was over 5 years for asset allocation funds. So being in an investment that has some degree of capital preservation can also help provide some mental security to an investor during tough times in the market, because they are being protected to some degree with some capital preservation strategies.
Number 3, going along with that, monitor risk tolerance. Now, this is really advice not only for the client, but for someone like myself. As a financial advisor, people's needs, circumstances, and their if you will, their investor discipline changes over time, right?
Absolutely. It's not something that's static by any stretch of the imagination. And in fact, we would go even further to say that an individual investor has different risk tolerance as it relates to different buckets of money or different goals. That your average investor will have, say, for example, there's some bucket of money that they're putting away for retirement, but maybe another piece of wealth that they're putting aside in hopes of maybe a second home. Well, your risk tolerance is not going to be the same for your second home as it may be for retirement, or as it might be for your child's college education. So when you look at the different accounts, the different purposes of those accounts, they too will have different risk tolerances associated with them.
And last but not least, you have to look at the forecast, you all right, in terms of probabilities, not just focusing necessarily on past performance, but what would X, Y, Z scenario mean in the future? That's imperative as well, right?
Right. What we've seen as a best practice, and there are some advisory firms that have this type of reporting or look at it from this framework, is looking at, based on the investor's goal, what is the probability that you'll achieve that goal? So running simulations. So I think a very basic example for a particular firm that I can think of, a large wirehouse in this country, is they will run 1,000 simulations, and then they will give you a score, which is really what percentage of those simulations you achieved your goal. So if you need to have X amount of dollars to draw down and replace your income in retirement, instead of I beat the market or I didn't beat the market, the question should be, or what one should be able to hang their hat on, is I still have a 90% chance of achieving my goal, which may be 20 years in the future, 5 years in the future, but providing it in terms of probability is something that everyone can understand and grasp, and that also can really help with investor behavior.